Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast. NFL football week 2 on the horizon. Some marquee matchups, and we'll kick things off in earnest with a tremendous Thursday night football showdown between the Buffalo Bills and the Miami Dolphins. I am your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague and co-host, Payne Insider. And Payne, 1 week in the books, 16 more games on the slate, plenty of action all around.
Yeah, here we are, week 2. Hopefully our fortunes go a little bit better this week. You know, that would be the goal.
We may have to go the Serrano route for Major League, sacrifice a live chicken to try and get the gambling gods on our side in the NFL with perfectly handicapped games, even when they go awry. But we will see what we have. Interesting note, after week 1 wrapped up, one of the most paltry performances we've seen from quarterbacks in the league in a long, long time. 188.3 passing yards per game per quarterback on average, the fewest in a week since week 15, 2007. Illegal formations, well, they were the course du jour, so to speak. And when you look at the hip drop tackle, apparently we're still not calling that, but either way, it's a different discussion. So, all right, my friend, want to get into the games. We may as well start with what's unfolding in your backyard tonight, where the Dolphins have been bet out to a 2.5-point favorite. We've seen the under take money. We're now down to that 48.5 range from where this opened at 50.5. The Bills, they have dominated the Fins, going 11-1 in their last 12 games versus Miami. It includes a win in Week 18 last year, where the Buffalo Bills were able to erase that 3-game deficit in the division with 5 games left to play. However, when you look at the Dolphins under head coach Mike McDaniel, they own the best win percentage during the month of September in NFL history with a minimum of 5 games going 7-1. You talk about the weather working in their favor. I'm sure Miami would prefer this was a 1 Eastern kickoff in the sweltering heat and humidity, but maybe the humidity still works on their side against the Bills team figuring things out defensively that was able to skate by with a 34-28 win last week against Arizona. When we look at Miami, Payne, doesn't take long for Raheem Mostert to miss work early on in the campaign. Devin Achane a little bit banged up at the running back position. We'll see if we get the debut of Jalen Wright out of Tennessee, if it's Jeffrey Wilson. But when you look at Miami offensively, I mean, 80% of the yards that they picked up in week 1 against the Jags came through the air. It was the highest rate in the league highest rate in the league for week 1. Easy for me to say, but here they have a chance to hit the reset button and try and pick up where they left off, where the offense looks significantly more dynamic after the break against the Jags than they did in the first 30 minutes.
So a couple of things there. One, you had to take your off-air shot at Raheem Mostert and on-air. That was the
I just want to see him healthy and out there running the football. Poor guy, continues to get himself dinged up. I feel bad for him.
And I don't necessarily think that nugget is overly shocking when you have Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle and a defense that was playing gobs of man coverage. So I think what's interesting here, and we spoke Monday. It's always good to go back and listen to our weekly recaps. I think they're extremely well done. I know a lot of people are trying to front run it with Sunday night live reaction stuff, but in terms of Monday morning, it's pretty good because you actually have the ability to get more data. A lot of that stuff isn't quite available Sunday night. We're running a bunch of that stuff, and you wake up Monday morning and boom, it's ready. I thought the Dolphins left a lot of offense out there, and I would give Ryan Nielsen credit for a solid Jags defensive game plan, but that was really the sloppiest Miami's offenses looked throughout camp. There was 5 drops, 2 is missing wide open receivers. Still an offensive effort that reached 400 yards and finished in the top half of the league in EPA per play, despite a lot of interesting things, specifically what transpired there in the morning. And it's difficult to, put a numerical value on that, but I would think it's a little bit more than a narrative-based hurdle. I need to get back on track tonight. right? And you mentioned Raheem Mostert being out. Devon Achane won't be 100%, but he'll be out there as my understanding, unless they just want to be uber conservative with him, which I don't know if you do that in a division game. Jeff Wilson is in the mix. Jalen Wright, who you mentioned, 3rd-round pick, should see the field if Achane doesn't go or exits early. I don't think Miami's going to be able to run the ball overly well on Buffalo. There's some serious questions inside with Miami's offensive line, and you look defensively, like Daquan Jones is really the barometer for opposing teams having success on the ground against Buffalo. Buffalo did a great job last week holding the Cards to the 4th lowest rushing success rate of the week, despite playing a ton of light boxes defensively. One of the defenses in the league that used the least amount of heavy boxes last week, and were still able to stop the run. So I don't think that's an area where Miami's going to be able to have a ton of success. To me, it's about the pass game, which you kind of hinted at the top, and I think that's really where you want to attack Buffalo in general. And I know you look at McDermott, that's where he specializes in the secondary. That's his calling card, and he seems to have secondaries that are better than the sum of its parts, but I don't love the parts, especially without Teron Johnson.
I would say that's the big loss. I mean, you lose a guy that's your slot cover corner, and he was outstanding in that role.
Yeah, massive loss for Buffalo with the forearm injury there to Johnson. Elite slot corner. Buffalo at times last week went with the 3 safety look. Taylor Rapp, DeMar Hamlin, and Cam Lewis, with the occasional sprinkling of Jamarcus Ingram defending the slot once Johnson went down. The defensive scheme Miami will see tonight is worlds apart from what Jacksonville ran. I expect Buffalo to live in zone. I'm interested to see how Mike McDaniel attacks the slot. Likely he's going to move Tyreek and Waddle into that area, right, and motion them in there. That's where, to me, Devon Achane potentially not being 100% hurts the ability to fully attack the slot. We knew Miami wanted to use Achane more in the pass game. We saw that 7 catches on 7 targets, 2.9 yards per route run in the opener against Jacksonville. It's why his receptions prop was steamed over all last week. I'd like to see Jonnu Smith more involved in that area, certainly less Braxton Berrios as a wide receiver. We talked about the Bills' decision to let Dodson walk in free agency and how that became magnified without Matt Milano. If you look at Terrell Bernard and Dorian Williams at linebacker, they struggled mightily in coverage against Arizona last week. McDaniels, I think, has to get the backs and Jonnu Smith matched up on those two. If Tua is comfortable and returns to the expected accuracy levels, I think Miami's able to do some things through the air tonight. But you go through this process, and it's like Miami isn't fully healthy to attack that slot area as much as you'd like, right? OBJ still on IR. Malik Washington, the kid they loved, they drafted out of USC. They had big plans for him, flashed in training camp, and he was going to be their starting slot receiver. Ends up getting injured a week or two before the season starts, and so he's not there, and that's why there was talk about getting Achane involved more, but then it just became so obvious once their slot weapons were down that's where Achane would have an impact. If he's 100% tonight, then it's you attack that area. If he's less than 100% or potentially leaves early, then you really don't have that surefire weapon to attack that obvious area of Buffalo's defense without Teron Johnson.
When you look on the other side, I mean, Buffalo 34-28, as we mentioned at the top, knocks off Arizona. But what was most impressive is Buffalo did everything they could to avoid going to third down. I mean, now I know the Arizona defense had a lot to do with that. Josh Allen injures his non-throwing hand, has said it's not going to be a factor in any capacity. And he has pretty much feasted on the Dolphins in general. When you look at his 11-2 record, averaging 286 yards per game, 50-plus rushing yards per game. He's the only player with 275 passing yards per game and 50 rushing yards per game versus a team in NFL history when you include the playoffs. I mean, consistently throwing multiple touchdown passes. We saw the Bills' commitment to the ground game, and and we knew that was going to be their point of emphasis this offseason, and the weather allowed them to be able to do it. Credit to Josh Allen. He was the consummate distributor. I mean, no Bills player had more than 5 targets. Got the ball to Keon Coleman, Khalil Shakir, Dalton Kincaid, a little bit of an afterthought there. But Miami defensively, you highlighted them in the good when we broke down the recap of week 1. They showed some things against the Jags where they were able to stymie them after the break, held Jacksonville to 105 yards. I know Josh Allen and company provide very different challenges that they're going to encounter today, but this feels like a very interesting chess match in and of its own right in terms of what Miami can do to at least contain the effectiveness of Josh Allen both as a runner and a thrower.
Much different. And I mean, this really hasn't been much of a rivalry with Buffalo winning 12 of the last 13, and it hasn't mattered the quality of the Dolphins defense or the coordinator at the time of the matchup. I mean, Josh Allen's just torched every version of the Dolphins defense since he's entered the league. 41 touchdowns in 13 career games against Miami. Joe Brady and Mike McDermott, having them kind of... Joe Brady's calling the offense, but the ideology is being dictated by McDermott, and it's kind of made it clearly defined. We saw that again last week with the Bills having a pass rate 7% below expectation despite having Josh Allen. Buffalo's offense is still kind of working through who its go-to guys are. Hopefully at some point the roles, at least in that area of, player personnel, get a little bit more defined and the key cogs emerge. But if Buffalo wants to win the most important games, I think they have to start trying to capture the ceilings of the young kids, right? Kincaid and Shakir and Keon. I know Curtis Samuel and Mac Hollins were brought in. They potentially raised the floor, not the ceiling. How Dalton Kincaid only has 1 target in a game Buffalo trailed by double digits, to me, is mind-boggling. You got to get that figured out. And it's like every single freaking game you watch Buffalo, it just looks harder than it should be. And then you go back and look at the data. It's like, we spent the first-round pick on Dalton Kincaid. We're trailing by double digits. Like, you got 1 target. It makes no sense, some of the things that transpire with this offense, and everything's on Josh Allen. And so, that was a really poor Cardinals defense. It's one that, it's going to end up finishing bottom 5 in the league this year. And the Bills' offense looked extremely clunky. I mean, you watch that first half, it's 3 points the first 29 minutes. Without Josh Allen being a miracle worker on 3rd and 6 to generate a touchdown before the break, it would have been pretty bleak. And so I'm not sure what we're getting out of Buffalo's offense. I believe that's partly why we're seeing this total tick down. Now, I do think Buffalo finds relative offensive success against the Dolphins tonight. I think the question mark with Miami's defense is still along the D-line. Jacksonville ended up doubling Zach Sealer in the middle and then just allowed 38-year-old Calais Campbell to be the playmaker. And Campbell was. He played extremely well, but you wonder about recovery on a short week for a 38-year-old. And, as a whole, the Dolphins still allowed 1.7 yards per rush before first contact. So even though we hate the Bills' offensive philosophy, it has a chance to work tonight. Anthony Weaver's defensive game plan for Miami, I think, is going to be pretty interesting because the pass rush we were concerned about with Van Ginkel gone and Chubb on IR and Wilkins gone actually showed better than expectation against Jacksonville. 8th highest pressure rate generated on non-blitz snaps with a 15% sack rate, which was number 1 in the NFL. I wouldn't expect that again against a better Bills O-line. The problem was without pressure, Miami secondary struggled. 11.8 yards per target allowed to wide receivers and a 75% completion rate. Jalen Ramsey is playing through a hamstring injury. There's a ceiling on what 3rd-year undrafted slot corner Kader Kahu is. And so I would attack Kahu with Khalil Shakir, who ran 82% of his routes from the slot week 1. And so, listen, I've made it known I don't love the shift and an ideology for the Bills offense, but I could see it working some tonight, running the ball right at Miami, spamming targets to the slot with Shakir and Kincaid. I mean, heck, even Kendall Fuller, who we really, really like and seems to be like a money ball type corner. He's 5'11". Keon Coleman's an elite contested catch guy at 6'4". So there's avenues here for the Bills offense, Todd. If They just let the young kids cook.
I'm so interested to see where the next move on this game goes. I mean, I know Miami opened as a 1.5-point favorite. It was the same price as the look ahead. We're out to 2.5, so books can create a little bit of that wiggle room there. Now, some of those sharper shops are juiced to 2.5. There are a couple books that are in a different spot, but I would be hard-pressed to believe this number actually touches 3 and gives people an opportunity to bet the Bills at that key number. From Thursday night, Payne, into Sunday, and we can start things off in the Motor City, where Detroit is back in action against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, a team whose season they ended last year in the postseason. It's Detroit, now out to a 7.5 consensus favorite across the board. Total in this game opened as low as 48, 48.5, up to 51.5. When we look at this Lions team, 13-5 since the start of last season. It's actually tied for the best record in the NFL. The Bucs have won 6 of the past 7 regular season games, and when you look at Baker Mayfield, a 15-3 touchdown to interception ratio during that span. If we go back to Week 8, the Bucs 9-3 against the number over their last 12 games. It's the best ATS mark in that span. The Lions are right behind them at 8-3. And when we look at the Lions, they have been a covering machine under Dan Campbell, 38-17 against the spread in his last 55 games at head coach. Detroit, last week, a little bit of a slow starter on the offensive side. They tried to establish the run, limited success. They got Jamison Williams going with a vertical passing game over the top. Amon-Ra St. Brown didn't contribute much in the way of the underneath game, but here they draw a favorable opponent, Payne, in the form of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers that we had some questions about defensively on the back end before the season started. Those questions don't get to be answered any quicker or easier when you're talking about a Bucs secondary that could be down as many as 3 starters that we saw in their Week 1 game against the Commanders.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best place to start. Is the Buccaneers defense is pretty banged up. I mean, 2 projected starters along the D-line, and Kalijah Kancey and Logan Hall didn't play Week 1. Hall got in a limited on Wednesday. I think he's closer than Kancey, who did not practice. Antoine Winfield Jr., arguably the best safety in the league and star of the Buccaneers defense, is out. Starting corner Zion McCollum is working through the concussion protocol. His backup, Bryce Hall, is likely out for the season with an ankle injury. Josh Hayes, a depth corner, missed Week 1 with an ankle injury of his own and was limited on Wednesday as well. So there's potential that they add someone to this room from now to Sunday. You look at the rest of the makeup of this defense, KJ Britt struggled in his new role as linebacker 2 beside Levante David. Levante David is now 35. I think he's going to be fine for this game, but trotted off the field with a little tweak of his own last week. This just is an extremely different animal, right, for Tampa's defense. This isn't a home opener against a rookie quarterback and an offensive coordinator in Cliff Kingsbury, who apparently did not use his time away from the league to revamp his offense, right? You have a young quarterback. Somehow it's the 5th lowest rate of motion used by the Commanders last week. Just mind-boggling again. Everyone just lines up, shotgun formation and just, runs down the field. That's the Cliff Kingsbury offense. There's really only one weapon with Terry McLaurin when you think about this. You move away from Jahan Dotson. Zach Ertz became like a target machine. Running backs were targeted the most. I mean, there wasn't anything that made you go, wow, Cliff Kingsbury really learned how to run an NFL offense in his time away. I don't expect Tampa to be able to get a ton of natural pressure here. Yaya Diaby was really the only threat last week with 5 pressures. Joe Tryon was disappointing again. Braswell had 0 pressures on 12 pass rush snaps. So Todd Bowles is going to have to dial up the blitz again. And if you look at Goff, he completely shredded Bowles' blitz in the last 2 meetings last season. And I think Goff has more answers this season. It's not just Amon-Ra St. Brown and Laporta. It's the guy you mentioned, right? And I understand it's a 1-game sample size.
Oh, it was eye-opening for a 1-game sample size, and the Lions delivered on their promise that they'd said he was going to be wide receiver 2 if they could get him to have the light go on.
But, yeah, I mean, everything Ben Johnson said during training camp was that, Jamison Williams is that guy. The route tree has grown exponentially. His confidence is through the roof, having his first full off-season. And when you look at how quarterbacks treated their receivers in Week 1, Jamison Williams was wide receiver 1 for Detroit. Finished 3rd in first read target share, which basically means if Goff is looking at J-Mo with his first read on a drop back, Goff was targeting him 43% of the time. He wasn't moving to his other weapons, right? Which means he's looking for him, but also J-Mo's winning enough on his routes to be open, and he actually finished third among all qualifying receivers in route separation week 1 as well. So to me, we don't need to go too far into this. This is pretty straightforward. Detroit's going to have real success on offense here.
When we look at the other side of the ball, Baker Mayfield joined Tom Brady last week along with Josh Freeman as the only quarterbacks in Bucs history with an 80% completion rate, 4 passing touchdowns, and no interceptions in a game. I mean, we talked about Baker and his effectiveness, led the league in nearly every major statistical category other than yards and some of the advanced metrics as well. We saw backfield by committee from the Bucs, Rashad White and Bucky Irving kind of splitting responsibilities there. Mike Evans continues to be like a fine wine and just gets better with age. Chris Godwin graded out as one of the top performers and should benefit immensely with his move back to the natural positional fit in the slot. 8 catches, 8 targets, 83 yards, and a touchdown. You saw flashes of Jalen McMillan. And in steps a Lions defense that had a chance to salt that game away with a 17-3 lead against the Rams and allowed Matthew Stafford to complete pass after pass after pass after pass to Cooper Kupp. Even after Puka Nacua had gone out of the game, Tyler Johnson, former Buck, flashed as well. When you look at the Lions defense, Payne, do the Bucs have a path to success of being able to put up a crooked number for the second time in as many weeks?
It's not going to look that good, I wouldn't think.
Well, it's hard to look that good. The Washington Commanders defense makes a lot of opposing offenses look good, which will provide an interesting data point for one team in the NFC East come Sunday.
I think this will be really interesting because we talked about Baker Mayfield and the Buccaneers offense back in August, and we reiterated some of those points on Monday. And we like Liam Cohen. And certainly the offense is going to be much better on early downs from a creation and philosophy standpoint. And it's going to allow Baker Mayfield, I think, to look even better. And, the weapons are plentiful. And Baker Mayfield's in a good headspace. And he's, right now very good physically. And I do think part of the extreme efficiency was a byproduct of a really poor Commanders defense. At the same time, I do think this offense is substantially better than we would have all thought it to be, and we were all saying, hey, regression's coming. We kind of pumped the brakes on that late in August, and just based upon offensive coordinator. And I watched that game on Sunday night, and the immediate thought to me is like, did the Lions defense improve at all? The Rams came into that game without both of their starting tackles on offense. In game, the Rams lost their backup left tackle, so they were on their third stringer at left tackle, lost their starting guard as well. Puka goes down, and somehow the Lions defense managed to blow a 17-3 lead. It was a little mind-boggling to me on how that defense looked. And then you're looking this week, right? A lot of the pieces that they had added are a little bit dinged. You're looking at Davenport. Let's see what that looks like with his groin injury, a guy who's been perennially injured. And they're a little short on defensive ends. Baker Mayfield also was getting rid of the ball super quick. So the one thing that the Lions had going for it last season was its ability to get pressure. They weren't always getting home and converting for sacks, but their pressure rate was top 5 in the NFL. So now you have Baker Mayfield with this new system, 2.36 seconds to throw last week, second fastest. The Commanders blitzed 45% of the time. That was something we talked about in the offseason, was Aaron Glenn going to dial back some of the blitz. He did in week 1 against the Rams. He probably thought he was going to be able to get natural pressure against a beat-up offensive line. That's not the case here for the Buccaneers. The offensive line looks like it's pretty good, although Luke Gadecki is going through the concussion protocol. But that's a unit that continued to grow as camp went on, and internally the Buccaneers felt like they were in a much better space heading into this season with their offensive line than last. You also look at what the Lions did defensively week 1, and they used a ton of man coverage. That certainly leaves the door open for Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, and now Jalen McClellan to win one-on-one. Mike Evans was second in average separation created week 1. You mentioned before the show, we talked a little bit, Brian Branch having some struggles in coverage in the slot. That was something we kind of stamped and said, hey, Chris Godwin is moving back to the slot. He was a real factor week 1. And then, we got Jalen McMillan having the very explosive touchdown, could have had another on the opening drive. So his speed really adds a different element to the offense. You mentioned the 2-back system there. For the Bucs, Rachaad White certainly still a factor, catching balls out of the backfield. Bucky Irving significantly better in the run game, specifically up the middle, just quicker vision, and so it's really provided some added elements to this offense that we didn't necessarily see coming. So I think the Buccaneers also have success this week. Is it on the level and in efficiency? Is it like in the 95th percentile?
Tough to replicate.
Yeah, it's tough to replicate, but I do think they have success here.
And look, correlated the way the betting market has moved. I mean, minimal resistance on the favorite from 6.5 through to 7.5, and the total ticking up from 48, 48.5, as getting as high as 52. A little bit of buyback there. You wonder where some of those stops.
Did it get to 52?
Yeah, it did get to 52.
I was anticipating at 51, and then it shot through there, and I didn't see a ton at 51.5. I was a little surprised. I did not see it get to 52. Not that this is like a massive reason to bet overs, and I would not bet this now. But you start to like add little elements to it just to kind of like, feel good about the position. There is one of the larger over referees in this game.
You always want all of those little unique wrinkles and quirks to work in your favor when a number this large, especially early on in the season. Interesting when you look at the Lions game last week, started off like a snail and still had a chance to flirt with being one of the higher scoring games of the weekend, even with those offensive line injuries that you mentioned for the Los Angeles.
And the Lions played like a snail. And they just decided to run the ball. They were testing that Rams brand new front, right, with all like sophomores and rookies, and they were able to move the pile as we saw in overtime. So they weren't really asked to be this hyper efficient offense, and still like managed to score 27. And Amon-Ra St. Brown had how many? I mean, he wasn't even a factor.
No,
so
he contributed as much as the two of us.
Yeah.
For what they were able to do.
This is just a much different look. Ben Johnson is creative. He's going to use motion, something that the Buccaneers defense did not see last week.
Quick trip from the Motor City to the Twin Cities. Another NFC North team playing host to what should be one of the more fascinating early games to watch unfold. It's the Minnesota Vikings against the San Francisco 49ers. The 49ers on the short week traveling across the country to take on a team they lost to a season ago on Monday Night Football. We're looking at San Francisco now a consensus 5.5 point favorite, although there are some 6s and even a 6.5 out there in the market. Total on this game got as low as 44.5, now out to 45.5, 46. 49ers have lost 7 straight games in Minnesota, dating all the way back to 1992. How relevant is that this weekend? Absolutely not at all. Rich Gannon, though, and Steve Young were the quarterbacks on that fateful day when I was all of 10 years old. When we look at the 49ers, they'll enter Sunday for the 29th straight game as a favorite during the regular season, the 4th longest streak since 2000. You look at Brock Purdy, he's been a favorite in all 27 career starts coming into this week, longest streak to start a career. As far as Kyle Shanahan, he's actually been pretty good against the number in true road games with the 49ers on short rest, going 8-2 against the spread in a 10-game sample size. But Payne, it's the Sam Darnold revenge game. Darnold cast aside from the 49ers, took on the job in Minnesota, dazzled in the first half with outstanding numbers and efficiencies, set his career high in consecutive completions to start a game with 12 last week against the New York Giants defense. We saw the Vikings lean on the aging wonder and Aaron Jones, who's now rushed for 90 yards in 6 straight games. But the Vikings a little bit banged up at the skill position. Jordan Addison, a long shot to play this weekend. Haven't seen him officially ruled out against the 49ers defense that did a great job adjusting on the fly. I mean, Garrett Wilson tormented them on an early drive. They held him in check, and the Jets, other than some late game scoring and getting another veteran involved in Alan Lazard, look pretty poised on the defensive side to create some complications for this Minnesota offense.
Boy, that was a TV guy lead in there. Sam Darnold revenge game? I mean, the guy was lost out in the ocean, and Kyle Shanahan threw him like a dinghy.
You know, we love these ridiculous storylines, and if I said it being dead serious, I'd have to laugh at myself in the mirror.
I got to tell you, this is this side of the ball I am struggling with. At the betting market level, it's impossible to get to like 6.5 in this spot. We finally saw Vikings money late last night, which is, depending on when you listen to this, I'll just say Wednesday night around 9:00. And nobody talking ball or betting felt better about Sam Darnold heading into this season than us. We were higher than market on Sammy D and the Vikings. His performance floor just had to be better than Nick Mullins and Joshua Dobbs with the surrounding talent. In saying that, this is a far more difficult challenge against the 49ers defense than what he faced a week ago. And the game state is likely different, which puts more on Sam Darnold's plate. So from a player market perspective, it feels like we're buying Sam Darnold potentially at his peak. And that's where I get a little skittish. I mentioned the surrounding talent. In this setting, though, it's Justin Jefferson and then what, right? TJ Hawkinson's out with a knee injury. Jordan
Josh
Addison,
Oliver.
Yeah.
Jalen Naylor.
Yeah.
Brandon Powell.
Yeah. Okay. Jordan Addison re-aggravated his ankle sprain from camp. If he plays at all, I would expect reduced snaps and obviously, could leave the game pretty early if he does try to go out there. So it makes me nervous without that second weapon. I was also pleasantly surprised by how good Nick Sorensen's version of the 49ers defense looked. Apparently a pretty sharp guy. A buddy of mine went to school with him. Got this information after the fact, but just really a savvy guy. And what we saw was a defense that was more aggressive, right? Fast to the ball. They were gang tackling. It just looked like a different energy level. Now, Nathaniel Hackett stinks. And Aaron Rodgers only threw to one side of the field the whole game, and Kevin O'Connell is far superior to Nathaniel Hackett. And Sorensen only has 5 days to prepare for an opponent and not an entire offseason. But within that, Sam Darnold and the Vikings' performance week one was, an O-line that to me struggled a little bit. 24th in pass block win rate. Darnold was pressured on 42% of dropbacks. He held on to the ball a little bit longer than you'd like to see, 8th highest rate. And where the Vikings offense excels with Kevin O'Connell is kind of attacking the intermediate part of the field, and that can take a little bit longer. You're just not going to have a ton of time with Bosa and Leonard Floyd on the ends, right? 18% pressure rate on pass rush snaps combined on Monday Night Football. They get natural pressure. They don't need to blitz, something the Giants had to do to get pressure on Darnold last week, and Darnold torched the Giants when they blitzed. 5 for 6, 2 touchdowns. So I'd expect to see the 49ers play more coverage here, make Sam think a little bit. San Francisco has done a really, really good job defending the intermediate part of the field for multiple seasons now. Top 5 in completion rate, passer rating allowed, yards per attempt. The 49ers just do a fantastic job, getting their drops in coverage, specifically Fred Warner at linebacker. So kind of forces the quarterback to be perfect and getting it over or around the linebacker, but before the corner or the safety can get there in layman's terms. The more I dig into this, the matchup isn't as great as I would have hoped for. But the price and situation was really driving my intrigue initially on Minnesota here, Toddy.
Real quick, Payne, when we look at the other side of the ball, you mentioned Brock Purdy having the opportunity to do some things against this Vikings defense. Even without Christian McCaffrey on Monday Night Football, we saw the 49ers with a top 10 rushing EPA rate. It was the coming out party of sorts for Jordan Mason. Most rushes by a 49er in a game since Frank Gore did it back in 2011. You love the symmetry there because I think Frank Gore was brought into their Ring of Honor, whatever they call it in San Francisco, for Monday night's game. Brandon Ayuk, a little bit pedestrian in his first game back after missing all of camp. You saw some fits and starts for this San Francisco offense that is clearly going to get on track. But the one thing that all of us knew to be true, held true on Monday Night Football, Trent Williams remains an absolute beast along the offensive line. And when he's out there, quite frankly, this 49ers offense is able to run at the level that Kyle Shanahan expects of them.
Yeah, I go back to a conversation we had this offseason about Brock Purdy taking that next step and, going from being a system fit in year one to an elite distributor in year two. And now, year 3, it's about raising the level of play around him. And I think we saw some of that Monday night against the Jets, right? No CMC. Ayuk was extremely rusty after sitting out camp. Huge touchdown drop. Trent Williams was good, but that wasn't his A game.
I can't believe he played as much as he did, by the way. Before, of course, he had to go to the locker room for IVs.
Right. And so he wasn't 100%. He was just kind of out there battling, and that's just who he is. And Brock Purdy, against an above-average defense, went out and finished 6th in EPA per play and 6th in drop-back success rate. Now, this is a really tough environment on a short week, different time zone. Brock Purdy specifically referenced how difficult it is to play in Minnesota. That's something we kind of outlined like 4 years ago with this new stadium, right? With the construction of it and how they have built-in noise, and there's like reflectors in their noise that like hit and then pump down onto the field. And so it's a massive home field advantage, truly is. It's one of like the rare ones in the NFL that's still worth the full allotment there. Now this time around, Brock Purdy's a little bit more prepared for it. He's going to have Trent Williams and Deebo Samuel, who weren't available for last season's matchup. It's also a game, if you remember, Todd, where Brock Purdy was a little bit foggy. Never left the game.
Yep,
but on the plane ride back home was diagnosed with the concussion. So I'm interested to see what Brian Flores elects to do here defensively. Deebo Samuel being available this time around is huge, because if you look, Flores used too high safety at an 84% rate against the Giants last week. The Vikings cornerback situation is bleak. You want to protect those guys, but the Giants receivers created 4.4 yards of separation last week. If Flores rolls that defense out again in this matchup, Brock Purdy has proven to be one of the league's most accurate passers. He is not Daniel Jones. Deebo Samuel has feasted against too high coverage. His target share against too high last season was 26%. The other element you always account for with Brian Flores is the astronomically high blitz rate, right? Saw that again last week. Flores blitzed Daniel Jones at a 43% rate. Brock Purdy, even without some of those weapons last year, without his left tackle, hung in the pocket, stood tough, delivered against the blitz. 13 of 15 for 11.8 yards per pass attempt Brock Purdy was against Brian Flores' blitzes last year. So let's also keep an eye on one of Flores' pressure guys. There hasn't been much talk at the national level, but Andrew Van Ginkel was held out late against the Giants, and I'm just thinking, okay, no biggie, it's a blowout. Doesn't practice on Wednesday. I see the designation. It's a foot injury. Van Ginkel had a Liz Frank injury late last season for the Dolphins, if you remember the disaster, and it required surgery. One of every Dolphin on that defensive side that was unavailable for the regular season finale or the playoff game. Yeah. That foot injury did require surgery. Hopefully this is just a sore foot that Minnesota is being extra cautious with, but it's one of the key injuries I'm monitoring later today to see if AVG is practicing, because the 49ers right tackle is Colton McKivitz. Played well Monday night. Last season he allowed an 8.5% pressure rate and 44 QB hurries with 9 sacks. So I really want to be on Minnesota in this spot. I just think Brock Purdy may have taken a step the market isn't aware of yet. He's been in this environment before. Purdy has more ammo this time. I'm not making a case for the 49ers at all. I'm just kind of stating some of the reasons I haven't quite gotten on Minnesota yet. Check your odds screen, 275, 276 as we wrap up the game in terms of what's actually coming in on the contest as we finish our breakdown on the Vikings and 49ers. On to the late afternoon schedule, a marquee matchup at least. I feel like it's going to surprise me the way you outlined. No, I don't think it'll surprise you at all. I think it's the move you kind of anticipated. But as we go into the late game, this was a matchup before the season started that I think would have had a little bit more buzz than what it does coming into this week, knowing the Cincinnati Bengals lost outright as more than a touchdown favorite in their opener against the New England Patriots. And as a result, we've seen the market respond accordingly. Kansas City, 3.5-point favorites on a look-ahead number, playing host to the
Cincinnati Bengals, that number got as high as 6, even a 6.5 that was out there, I believe, earlier this week. Total's been interesting when you watch 46.5 up to 48.5, now back to 47.5. So something to monitor there with very different opinions impacting that market. It'll mark the 5th meeting between Mahomes and Burrow. It's the 3rd quarterback rivalry ever, where the first 4 meetings were all decided by 3 points or fewer. And when you look at the other quote-unquote rivalries, Geno Smith versus Tom Brady, not a rivalry. Dave Craig versus Warren Moon, not necessarily a full-on rivalry with those games either. Burrow does own 3 wins over Patrick Mahomes, which ties him with Tom Brady and Josh Allen for that impressive distinction. The Bengals, however, are looking to try and avoid yet another 2-0 start. No team in NFL history has had 3 straight winning seasons after starting 0-2 in each year. The Bengals went 12-4 back in 22, 9-8 in 2023. And when we look at Patty Mahomes, who was celebrated his birthday earlier this week, Sunday will mark his 98th career game. He already has the most regular season wins, passing touchdowns, and passing yards by any quarterback in his first 100 career games. This only provides a little bit more fuel to the fire. Payne, I know this is a team that you know all too well in Kansas City, so I'm interested to get your take if you find Mahomes matched up against the Bengals defense to be the matchup to watch, or the other side of the ball to see if Joe Burrow is able to stretch the field a little bit more effectively than what we saw in his return from injury week 1 against the Patriots, where they basically dropped 8 and allowed Burrow to dink and dunk his way to a grand total of 10 points and one of the lowest average depth of targets that we saw for week 1.
One of those games where it seems like everyone I speak to has a very, very large opinion on it, and I'm just sitting back as the Chiefs guy here, saying to myself, I kind of want to see how this plays out. I mean, we've seen an adjustment in the market to the adjustment, right? Look ahead line was Chiefs 3.5. Chiefs beat Ravens. Bengals fall to the Patriots. We reopen at 6.5. Now back down to 5. This very much feels like a price conversation in that last December, the Bengals went into Arrowhead with Jake Browning as their starting quarterback, and that game closed Chiefs 7. How could this possibly be 6.5 with Burrow? And I think that's the thought process and reasoning for the trickle down since open on Cincinnati. The matchup is interesting because, you know, all the eyes are on Joe Burrow and the Bengals offense. And we felt since his O-line improved this offseason, right, adding Trent Brown, drafting Amarius Mims, one way or the other, whoever it was starting at right tackle, that problem was going to be solved. Burrow was only pressured on 22% of dropbacks against New England. Big improvement. Now, it's a Patriots defensive line without Judon and Barmore, but it looked improved. So you give kind of a check mark there, even in a shoddy performance. The Bengals are notoriously slow starting. T. Higgins is out. Chase missed virtually all of camp. There's a lot of built-in reasons for the week 1 struggle. I think we find out this week if those excuses hold water. Now, T. Higgins is still, I think, a long shot here. Because there's certainly another side to that coin. And it's that Joe Burrow isn't 100% healthy. And I know we've never once speculated, but we did find Stephania Bell's August 13th comments regarding Joe Burrow to be quite interesting. And I'll paraphrase, but basically Stephania said there is no comp for quarterbacks with this type of wrist ligament tear that Joe Burrow had. And that Burrow is dealing with soreness, stiffness in his hand. It's why he shakes it out. He's needed rest days towards the end of training camp. Bell went on to say, if Burrow had another 6 months, I'd feel differently. It's not about the structural integrity, but it's more about the volume of work that's required to be a quarterback in the NFL. And so right off the bat, week 1, what did we say? It was Burrow constantly shaking out his hand to help with the stiffness that Stephania was mentioning. He was wearing a sleeve on the arm and protection on the wrist. Now, this has gotten so large that if you saw Burrow on Wednesday during his practice, he removed the sleeve.
Oh, he got asked about it repeatedly in his media availability this week.
So I'm interested to see if it stays off for the game. I'm just in wait-and-see mode. I don't know what to expect from Cincinnati's offense. It's difficult to envision things being worse than last week. I mean, Burrow's intended air yards were 5.6. It was the 6th lowest mark of any quarterback week 1. And then despite the short passes, Burrow had a completion rate 4% below expectation. Even last season, you know, Burrow was dead last in rate of passes, 10-plus yards downfield. And you know, why I'm being more hesitant is Burrow actually had preseason reps unlike prior years, right? He played in the finale against Tampa. Whereas, like, you could make excuses for all of, like, the slow starts in years prior of, like, recovering from injuries and not playing in preseason. Again, I know Chase has been holding out, and T. Higgins is what T. Higgins is at this point. Like,
looking for a new deal somewhere outside of Cincinnati.
Yeah, right? Like, I think if the games are uber important, and I don't know. I got reports that he was just kind of floating around in camp, basically. I think if you're going to get the Chiefs defense, now would be the time, right? They're a touch thin along the D-line. They're still figuring out their secondary. They're mixing and matching pieces. Chamari Connor played safety last season. Spags started him at nickel last week with Trent McDuffie's planned move outside. You go look in crunch time, we saw Joshua Williams and Jalen Watson, who are playing extremely well, outside with McDuffie back in the slot. So, I'm not quite sure what's going on there in the secondary. It wouldn't shock me to see McDuffie do some traveling with Chase. And at that point, like, which Bengals weapon is keeping a defensive coordinator up at night, right? Like, if McDuffie is mirroring Chase, like, who are you completely fearful of past Chase? Like, we'd heard all camp it was Yoshiva, right? And how he was flashing 0.7 yards per route run week 1. Not much better than his career average. The Bengals offense, I think, needs to get this figured out. We just always assume they will. But it's really done nothing but decline since the 2022 Super Bowl run. And, in this setting where we think the Bengals defense isn't at the level it was relative to prior high leverage Cincy KC games, right? At the same time, the Chiefs' offense is probably taking a step forward. You need Burrow in that offense potentially more now than ever. And so I have to see it.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm not ready to make that leap of faith.
To your point, talking about the Bengals' slow start, I was blown away by this nugget about their perennial slow starts and how people sometimes a narrative takes on a life of its own, even without being validated from a number standpoint. Going all the way back to weeks 1 and week 2 of 2020, the Bengals have run 598 plays on offense during weeks 1 and week 2. Only 7 of those plays in total have gone for 25-plus yards. That's 1.2% that would qualify as big plays in that particular regard. I mean, from a yards per attempt standpoint, yards per play, none of the metrics leave you brimming with confidence that they have the capabilities as currently constructed right now to attack that new-look Chiefs defense. Meanwhile, on the other side, I mean, I think the scoreline...
I don't want to cut you off, but
yeah.
There's been some conversations, and I'm not saying this is going to happen, so don't spaz out on me, Bengals fan. There is obviously, historically the Bengals organization has been quite cheap, but there's also been a little bit of a figuring out of this offense and how to defend some of the receivers. And Burrow's always been very good at identifying pre-snap where his matchup advantage has been. And so, the injuries to the receivers, the holding out, T. Higgins not always being there, that certainly impacts some things. But I think as good as Jamar Chase is, people have started to figure out, hey, we can't really zone this team because historically Burrow is so accurate. He gets the ball out on time, and that's where Chase feasts, is catching the ball, finding holes in the zone, run after the catch. His numbers have fallen off a cliff now that teams man him more and don't play as much zone against Jamar Chase. And I think that's potentially where some of the contract dispute is happening here.
Look,
that, his view of himself is still of 2-3 years ago and not necessarily of what it's been here recently.
A wide receiver that doesn't view himself as the number one wide receiver in the game in this day and age, Payne, is he truly a number one wide receiver? On the other side of the ball, look, Kansas City, that scoreline against Baltimore, they were much better than what those numbers actually suggested. When we look at Patrick Mahomes, he averaged 10.4 yards per attempt in week 1, but his best in a game since week 7 back in 2022 at the 49ers. And when we look at that worthy touchdown catch, it was just Mahomes' third passing touchdowns of 20+ plus air yards since the Tyreek Hill trade. And the numbers don't lie. I mean, we knew Xavier Worthy was going to be a burner and a different force to contend with. This offense will only get more dynamic when you add Hollywood Brown back into the fold. But the real beneficiary was truly Rashee Rice. He had 102 of his 103 receiving yards with Worthy on the field. 83 of those came between the hash marks when Worthy was running coverage off. And you look at Rashee Rice coming into his own as a true number one. 621 receiving yards since week 12 in 2023. Second in the NFL in yards after the catch since the start of last season, behind only Tyreek Hill, which is rarefied air. And Payne, that's even before we get to the Bengals questions they have to answer when it comes to stopping the run. Ramondre Stevenson went absolutely nuclear. We talked about how this run defense fell off a cliff without DJ Reader, and Isaiah Pacheco looked fresher than ever last week against the Baltimore Ravens.
Yeah, I don't really know where we need to go here.
Get Xavier
Brown,
Worthy into that fantasy lineup and Isaiah Pacheco, I guess.
Hollywood Brown looks like he's going to miss again, so potentially, one less weapon for the Bengals defense to have to worry about. Listen, I think when you look last week, you saw what this offense can be, and it's still not fully there yet. But Patrick Mahomes was very good despite some turnover-worthy throws and some head-scratchers. 58% success on dropbacks. Number 2 in EPA plus completion percentage over expectation, only trailing Baker Mayfield and Josh Allen, who had significantly easier matchups defensively. I don't know how the Bengals, if Reed and Mahomes truly attack, get stops, right? If you even look last week where New England had some success, you mentioned it, on the ground up the middle, right? That was one of the areas where they just attacked with Ramondre Stevenson. Now, they attacked in their version of attack, which means 16 points on the board.
AKA with no threat of a passing game, they could still run it effectively.
They could still run it up the middle. And this was something that we've talked about over the years, the on-off field splits for the Bengals run defense without DJ Reader, who is now with the Detroit Lions. And so you get to a situation where you're thinking even late in the game where Andy Reid gets a little bit conservative like he did against the Ravens, and we're just handing it off to Pacheco inefficiently. That might probably be a little more efficient this week against this run defense. But even last week, think about where all the targets came from for Jacoby. Targeting Austin Hooper. Who? Austin Hooper. Yeah. I mean, 2 receptions.
I didn't know he was
right?
still in the league.
Yeah, I mean, Hunter Henry. It's Demario Douglas in the slot. A lot of the damage was done in the slot. That's where Rashee Rice lives. You have 2 linebackers who aren't great in coverage. You still have Kelsey who can run around the slot. So I don't like this Bengals defense. And maybe Lou Anarumo comes up with something masterful here. We've seen it happen before in these matchups where he can kind of just find the right button to click that negates the Chiefs' offense for a large enough stretch in the game to make it competitive or ultimately pull off the upset. Maybe he comes up with that here. It's just Reed and Mahomes with extra time again. And to me, there's just not as many chess pieces on this Bengals defense for Lou Anarumo to kind of move around the board.
Yeah, I mean, this feels like it's a little bit of a class difference here. You can understand how close these games have been in the past, but oftentimes you can't go back to 2021 and use that to make a determination on what to expect here. I get people's willingness to try and take the dog, especially at a secondary key number, on a price tag that looked inflated given the disparate results of last weekend, but it's a little bit of buyer beware, and we'll see exactly.
6.5's a different conversation than 5 that we're having this morning, Wednesday.
And a much different conversation, too, than 3.5. There is no doubt about it whatsoever. Should be a fun game to watch to see how these teams match up against one another. Want to remind all of you, our loyal Bet the Board listeners, to follow Payne on social media at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, as always, for all things NFL, college football, NASCAR playoffs, you can follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And if you haven't already subscribed to the Bet the Board podcast newsletter, I encourage you to do so. Great information delivered to you in a timely fashion on Friday. A reminder of anything you may have missed during the course of the week. Additional prop bets and some other items to get you to the window. As we said, a rocking chair winner last week with Ezekiel Elliott's longest rush under 11.5. And we'll see what we can find in the prop market this weekend that makes the cut. Into Sunday Night Football, Payne. The Houston Texans playing host to the Chicago Bears. Houston, a 6-point favorite in the game, total 45.5. We've seen a little bit of dog money come in. We've seen a little bit of under money. And the only question I have for both of these fan bases, will Lovie Smith be in attendance to make the ceremonial coin toss, knowing the impact he's had on both of these franchises, directly responsible for the Houston Texans having Will Anderson and C.J. Stroud, and for the Bears having Caleb Williams, DJ Moore, and a heap of other talented players, including Darnell Wright, Tyreek Stevenson, and yet again another second-round pick, courtesy of the Carolina Panthers. This will be the first Sunday Night Football game for the Houston Texans since 2019. The Bears, meanwhile, have been a disaster on Sunday Night Football, riding a 7-game losing streak, have lost all of those games by 10-plus points. The Bears, though, last weekend became the third team in NFL history, as our listeners know all too well, with a 17-point comeback win and 0 offensive touchdowns in the same game, joining the 2016 Chiefs and the 2006 Chicago Bears. As far as rookie starting quarterbacks, they've actually been very good in prime time going back to 2022. 12-4-1 against the number. And surprisingly enough for Bears fans that may want to take a little bit of solace in this, number 1 overall picks in prime time during their rookie season. It's not a massive sample size. The wins aren't there, just 1-5 straight up, but they are 5-0-1 against the number. When we look at these two teams, Payne, the Houston Texans offensively were able to move the ball. They got all 3 wide receivers involved against Gus Bradley and his unwillingness to change how he elects to defend Nico Collins. Joe Mixon looked like he experienced the fountain of youth with the record-setting rushing performance for him in his Texans debut and leading the league in that particular category. But for all the questions that the Bears had offensively, their defense answered the bell against Will Levis and company and even found a way to put points on the board, knowing their offense wasn't going to help them.
Yeah, I thought the Bears' defense showed pretty well again, which is to be expected. Now, I think, Bobby Sloak and C.J. Stroud are a little bit of a tougher test for Eberflus, but I think the inverse is true as well. I mean, Sloak and Stroud aren't going to know what's coming every single snap. I think we've said this no less than 10 times over the years, but Gus Bradley does what he does, and that's live in cover 3, and he made it much easier on the Texans offense last week, living in that again, and I think he played man coverage at like the lowest rate in the league, 2% last week. So I just kind of know what you're getting. Matt Eberflus also loves zone looks, right? He'll sit in cover 2, he'll rush 4, he wants to make the opposing offense put together these long drives, bend but don't break. Now, if you've followed the Bears offseason, some of which you've been able to do with Hard Knocks, it's been about expanding the menu board defensively, so to speak. So I'm interested to see what this looks like. We believe the Bears defense is good. We saw the strides it made from week 10 onward last season. But again, they haven't been tested in ages. You think about this, right? Like over this sample size that leaks now into this season, the only like true tests over the sample size are like familiar division opponents the second time through the batting order, right? It was like
in mediocre weather. The game against the Lions in early December was ugly, and then Jordan Love dealt with frigid temperatures in that regular season finale where Green Bay was made to look pedestrian.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so, like, coming into the season, we knew the strength of quarterback Chicago was facing year over year would be the 6th largest increase. So it was just going to be much tougher. And you look, during the back half improvement last year, Chicago faced like Taylor Heineke and DTR and, Bryce Young as a rookie and Derek Carr and, Pete Carmichael's offense. And, the 2 losses down the stretch came against the Packers and Lions despite being, getting some help from that weather you mentioned. Houston will be a difficult test. It's not a familiar opponent. We'll see if that trio of Jalen Johnson and Stevenson and Kyler Gordon are ready to kind of put the league on notice and lock up Nico, Diggs, and Tank. There's been a ton of optimism for that trio all offseason. The matchup to think about, and the one to me that's the key, is up front. And I think we know, regardless of quarterback or receiving weapons, Bobby Sloak's going to run the ball more than a fair amount. And Billings in the middle for Chicago has been just a one-man run stopper inside. Jervon Dexter helped out last week. We saw DeMarcus Walker, play a touch more inside and really had a monster week. But I'm looking at those 4-down looks. there just has to be another guy to disrupt past Montez Sweat on the edge. And most of the focus is on Sweat. But last week, Darrell Taylor became that X factor. He took advantage of having little focus, 5 run stops, a forced fumble, 3 pressures, and he was basically clean, right? I mean, it was double teamed on 5% of snaps. I don't think Laramie Tunsil and Titus Howard were very good week 1. Tunsil's elite. He's going to be fine. Howard is the guy you want to attack on this. He's the guy you want to attack on the Texans O-line. If the Bears can negate some of Slowick's ground game with Billings, right? Take advantage of Slowick when he wastes more downs than he should. Parlay that into taking advantage of Titus Howard in 2nd and long and 3rd and medium plus situations. I think if they do that, the Bears will have a chance to hold their own here Sunday night, and what to me is the biggest test they've had since that Week 10 improvement in 2023.
Before we get to the other side of the ball, the 6s that I mentioned being the prevailing number in this game, no longer out there. Houston bet up to a 6.5-point favorite as we break this game now. To the other side of the ball, looking at Houston defensively, Payne. I mean, this was a stop unit that left a little bit to be desired, for a lack of a better term, against the Colts when it came to defending the explosive plays. We saw the secondary potentially going to be a work in progress. A couple of big plays to Alec Pierce. We saw A.D. Mitchell go deep as well. But can the Bears fix, or at least make modest improvements to what was a non-existent offensive attack in Caleb Williams' debut? They're dealing with some injuries. Rome Odunze and Keenan Allen. Rome with the MCL, Keenan Allen with the heel, were both DNPs on Wednesday. The ground game with DeAndre Swift didn't offer much punch whatsoever. And Caleb Williams averaged 3.2 yards per attempt versus Tennessee in Week 1 on 29 attempts after averaging 9.2 yards per attempt during his college football career. Can he make a Week 1 to Week 2 improvement against this Texans secondary and defense?
I mean,
can't get worse.
It was a disaster against Tennessee. I mean, missed throws you expect the number 1 pick to make, throws that Caleb has shown he can make because he's got an elite arm, right? I mean, but 17% of the throws were deemed inaccurate. The delta between intended air yards and completed air yards was the 2nd largest among quarterbacks. There was also just a ton of panic in the pocket, and Caleb only faced pressure on 27% of dropbacks. But when that pressure came, 1 for 7 with a turnover-worthy play. You look in totality, every time Caleb Williams dropped back to pass, 33% of the time he busted, which means a play generating at least -1 EPA. That was the highest rate among any quarterback in the NFL last week. So it is hard, to your point, to envision Caleb going anywhere but up because the debut was so horrific. The environment, though, is going to be chaotic, right? Sunday Night Football, loud dome environment, with it being the Texans' home opener in a year where there's heightened expectation and everyone thinks they have a surefire winner here, right? So it's going to be pretty rowdy there. We have a lot of respect, obviously, for DeMeco Ryans. He's surely going to disguise coverages and give Caleb trouble from time to time, but it's tough to gauge because Caleb can't be worse. But DeMeco isn't like scheming against Shane Steichen here either. It's Shane Waldron this week, a guy we're not overly in love with. So from a scheme perspective, it's going to get probably a little bit easier. So I would expect an uptick with the Texans defense in this spot. I mean, when you have Steichen and this 1-2 running punch of Richardson and Jonathan Taylor, you have to be disciplined, right? You can't be undisciplined. You got to be a little bit more reactionary than just kind of going out there with like a chicken with your head cut off, shooting gaps. Now, stopping run was a little bit of a problem for Houston last week. It was an issue they had last year as well, but
they did do a better job with Jonathan Taylor, who torched them in Week 18. They just couldn't stop Anthony Richardson.
Yes, and that's kind of like the trade-off there. The running back runs were fantastic, to your point. I believe they only allowed 3 yards a carry to Jonathan Taylor, but like in totality, when you factor in those legs, right, 53% rushing success rate against the Colts last week, and that's kind of why I'm saying, like, Shane Steichen is going to give you something to think about. He had all offseason to drum up this game plan against a familiar opponent, a guy he knew what the scheme was, and now it's like, DeMeco's going against Shane Waldron, which is a little bit of a drop down in class.
A mismatch, to say the least.
Is Chicago's offense, though, the group that can actually take advantage of a potential run defense that might not be elite? I'm not sure. Like, the reason you go out and get DeAndre Swift is more for his ability out of the backfield than it is as a runner. And he just wasn't an overly efficient runner last week. He wasn't an overly efficient runner behind an elite Eagles offensive line. And that's why they went out and signed Saquon Barkley, and they're like, my God, if Saquon's doing this with that offensive line, imagine what he's going to do behind this offensive line. And sure as shit, like game one, it's like, oh, Saquon's actually really freaking good. And so, I mean, they just, and then you think about like the value that Swift brings is like catching the ball in the backfield, and Caleb doesn't really target running backs, never really has. Maybe that will change a little bit here, but like one catch on 20 routes run for Swift last week. So I don't really know his value because he's not like the greatest like between the tackle runner. And if you're not using him as a pass catcher, it's like, where does the, I don't know. I'm interested to see if Waldron gets easier throws for Caleb too, like bigger targets with Kmet and Everett, and Everett's kind of leading that snap share there between the tight ends. I don't, again, one hand not washing the other. You just signed Kmet to this monster deal, and the guy you just brought in for scraps this offseason is leading the tight end room. Rome is out. Keenan is battling through a heel injury. If healthy, you'd expect better chemistry between Keenan and Caleb. The targets were through the roof, 11, but only 4 completed balls. I just think this is, to me, like a lot to ask for Caleb in this spot. But it's like impossible to look worse than last week. And you kind of mentioned at the top there, more money coming into the market. It's what we've seen all week. And it was inevitable. So, like, guys are getting out ahead of it because you grab Houston at prices knowing there's going to be nothing but one-way action for a standalone primetime game. I do think, it'll be interesting to see if there's I would assume we're getting to 7 here.
I would think
books are going to have to throw it out there to see if they can get a couple nibbles of Bears money to balance some things.
I was surprised we saw a modest buy on the Bears earlier this week from 6.5 down to 6. You figure you wait this thing out as long as possible.
Was weird.
Yeah, 7 was definitely going to be in the mix. We saw it last week on Sunday Night Football. The Lions took money early in the week from 3.5. I'm not sure that was the side when you watch that football game unfold, although they did have a 14-point lead. Number got as high as 5, and books found themselves with all sorts of liability going to the favorite after favorites went 13-3 straight up. We'll see how the rest of this Sunday plays out, and it'll change some of the dynamics in play in terms of where that next move comes from. And like you said, let's see what Caleb Williams can do in his second game. You'd like to see him on the move a little bit more. You'd like to see him extend plays with his legs. He's extremely athletic, but as a number 1 overall pick in the draft, I can't see a scenario where the Bears elect to run him the same way as the Commanders did with Jaden Daniels. But look,
wasn't overly efficient as a runner last week either.
He looked unwilling to run for stretches as well.
Him and Richardson are 2 different animals in the run game.
100%. One guy will put his foot in the ground and try and bull you over. Caleb decided he wanted to run backwards on a couple of plays and take a 19-yard sack.
Caleb's mobility is more for buying time and searching out downfield. That's his version of mobility. To your point though, like I was a little surprised to see that initial touch of Bears money. It's really interesting because there's so many new players in the market, and a lot of them are just numbers based, and their market entry in terms of timing is like a drunk monkey fucking a banana peel. They don't quite have that sophistication level to them yet. They just the model says this and they go, and it just doesn't matter what day or time it is. So that was a little weird to get that Bears buy at that point, because I think there was going to be a substantially better number there, which we see now, and then potentially again as we get to Sunday evening. I mean, that total last Sunday night between the Rams and Lions, if you're just watching the board, you're like, holy shit, 2-point move here. No one on planet Earth that I know is going over 52 right before kick and sending it to 53.5 when for the last 6 months, that game was up and had substantially better numbers. So the public does have its say in these standalone primetime games, and you've been behind the counter. Depending on how the earlier games go in the day, there's probably a little bit more of a willingness to adjust some numbers if it's gone shitty earlier in the day.
100%. If all of your parlays are clicking into favorite and over, you're going to move much more proactively. And, every book these days feels like they take sharp action despite taking $72 grocery dollars on a lot of these games, and as a result don't even want to dangle some of those numbers out there. And it's what we always talk about. Your goal as a bookmaker is to be able to balance your books and create leverage and positions that you feel comfortable with, but to not even dangle a 7 out there in this game, I would be shocked if we don't get to 7, at least at some shops, come Sunday night, to at least gauge what the appetite might be from professional bettors. But there's a reason I'm doing this now, and I'm not behind the counter, given some of the philosophies that we see rolling out across the landscape. You can follow Payne on social media at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there for all things Bet the Board podcast related. Be sure to follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And best bet time of the program, Payne. The world is our oyster. Where do we think the best opportunity exists to get to the window come Sunday, NFL Week 2?
That is actually not true, as we saw yesterday.
It's awful right now. It's so difficult to do what we do with the lag time from when we record before when the show goes live. I'm not even going to call them niche markets. I mean, the first half total, gave our listeners no chance.
I think in general, the first thing that you have to be cognizant of is you got to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Seeing Todd tweet out the show 3.5 hours after it actually went live at 12:45 is probably going to be a mission in futility there. But 6 minutes is probably not enough, and so giving out totals becomes very, very difficult. It's just kind of the nature of the beast, and I'm not going to go too far into the weeds here. Let's just put it that way. In a manner to give something out here that's going to absolutely be available, I'd like to give out a total. I don't know how long it's going to last if we do it. So let's just give out something that we know is potentially going to last. It's probably not something everyone's going to love, but it'll be quite simple. One of the games we broke down was Tampa-Detroit. A game we did not break down was Pittsburgh-Denver. Just doing this quickly, let's go with a 6-point advantage teaser. Denver Broncos plus 8.5 to the Detroit Lions. You can get 1.5 depending on where you shop there. So a 2-team 6-point teaser. I think, again, it's time-stamped above. We talked Tampa Bay and Detroit. Don't need to go too far into that, but I think the injuries in the secondary are a little bit problematic for Tampa, especially now that you're facing an offense and an offensive mind that is far more sophisticated than what they faced a week ago against the Commanders. Denver is simply just your advantage teaser leg, right? Getting through the 3 and the 7 with a total of 36.5. Pittsburgh isn't going to put on a fireworks show offensively, so you have a low variance game with that. We know Denver has had great home field advantage early in the season at Mile High, and then also you have 2 points of confirmation, right? Buy at 3.5, another buy at 3. So we feel good about that teaser, but also feel good about this not completely destroying the market and everyone having an ability to get to it. Do we want to give out teasers? No, but we got to kind of figure out the best strategy moving forward. And this buys us a little bit of time, but also a plus EV bet that we'll both be making.
Always get caught between a rock and a hard place. We want these numbers to be widely available. We understand the market influence this show has for a lot of our loyal listeners that move at a variety of shops. So yeah, there are games that aren't going to move at all. Probably not a ringing endorsement in terms of getting your edge and your coveted closing line value. So a little bit off the beaten path, going the teaser route to make sure that all of our listeners can get their money in good when it comes to NFL Week 2. Anything else you'd like to share, kind sir, before we take a little break? We'll be back on Monday to preview Falcons at Eagles and share all of our learnings for what we saw with a second data point to be able to put in the chamber.
No. Chat on Monday, kind sir.
All right, we will do that then. For Payne Insider, I'm Todd Fuhrman. Best of luck with all of your NFL Week 2 investments, but most importantly, with the 2-team advantage teaser in hand come Sunday afternoon, we'll see you at the window.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Bet the Board. Make sure you follow Todd and Payne on X. Todd is at Todd Fuhrman. That's TODDFUHRMAN. And Payne is at Payne Insider. That's PAYNEINSIDER. Don't forget, our weekly newsletter comes with an additional best bet. Have that delivered to your inbox by clicking the link atop the podcast show notes. And most importantly, subscribe and download Bet the Board. We're on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Wondery, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and all your other major platforms.